Mitzi Van Cleve. I'm here again to talk to you about OCD and panic disorder. This is my third talk on YouTube on this topic. The last talk that I did was about how OCD kind of ignites or starts in an individual. And one of the analogies that I like to use is where I talked about the person with OCD having a fly trap kind of brain. And this is a brain that I guess you would say is predisposed to overreacting to questions that are upsetting, unwanted intrusive thoughts that just happen to float into the consciousness, and how the person with OCD has the anxiety center in their brain is primed or predisposed to overreacting to those thoughts because of too much fight or flight chemistry. What I thought I'd do before getting into how to overcome or how to deal with the thoughts which get trapped in the fly trap mind, which I said I would be talking about next, is to just kind of give a brief section from my book, which talks about a particular incident of a theme actually beginning with my OCD, so you can kind of see how this happens. I decided to read this portion because in my experience, there's really nothing so comforting as finding one other person who has experienced something similar to you with OCD. It's a very disturbing and unsettling thing, and it's a rather isolating experience. And sometimes when you just hear from somebody else about their experience and their story, it's comforting. It lets you know that there's hope and this person managed to get through it, and maybe I will too. So I'm going to share a small chapter from my book on a particular OCD theme and how it began. This is from chapter 16 from my book, Strivings Within OCD, Panic Disorder, and the Life of Faith. And it's entitled The Towering Terror, and I'm going to be reading that to you. It's chapter 16. It starts off with a quote from John Bunyan, and he says, "Of all the temptations that I've ever met within my life, to question the being of God and the truth of his gospel is the worst and the worst to be borne." And this is where my story begins. It was during those weeks, while I was waiting for my GP to come back, that my disorder took the ugliest of all turns. My inability to sit still for very long made it hard for me to relax enough to focus on studying my Bible, so I decided that a good alternative might be to listen to some sermons on CD. My son had given me a sermon series that had impressed him and which he wanted to share with me, so I decided I would start with those. I figured I could listen and do other things at the same time in an effort to distract myself. At first, I found the sermons encouraging and insightful, but then about midway through the series, I encountered a sermon that prompted a new obsession that would lay me lower than I'd ever been before. In retrospect, I've given this sermon a new title that fits the way my disorder twisted it and used it to torture me. I call it the "You Might Not Really Be a Christian If" sermon. I remember that day so clearly. I was doing the dishes while listening when just this one phrase grabbed my attention and dealt me such a vicious blow that I thought I'd never be able to get up again. It was like having a big bully sneak up behind you, tap you on the shoulder, and just as you turn to see who it is, he sucker punches you. You stagger backwards, reeling with dizziness, and collapse on the floor in a heap, unable to get up and fight back. The sucker punch that my bully used against me came wrapped up in a particular phrase that went something like this: "There are a lot of folk who think they are Christians, but if they are still struggling with sin, then they might not be." Whoa! My brain felt as if it might explode in reaction to that statement, and a cold fist of terror wrapped around my heart. Those words, when they'd had a chance to sink in, ignited a barrage of horrifying accusations which would soon morph into an all-consuming dread of the possibility of hell and eternal separation from God. What if I'm not a Christian after all? I struggle with sin in some way nearly every day. What if I've just been fooling myself all along? What if my belief isn't good enough? Maybe that's why I have all this fear and anxiety. Could this be God's way of warning me? I need to know. How can I know for sure? The questions and doubts poured out like water from a burst dam, and the aftermath that this torrent left behind was a deep gouge in my brain of confusion, dread, and incredible sorrow. This new mental war was far worse than any I'd engaged in before. I wanted to turn back the clock, erase my thoughts. I wanted to unthink these things. But I knew that short of having my memory erased, that was impossible. These hissing and menacing accusations would come at me relentlessly, and I felt that I had no choice but to fight back. I would work very hard to gather as evidence against these condemning notions. I would use scripture after scripture to reassure myself that I still belong to God. Yet every time I'd think I'd won this war, a new question would pop into my head. These doubts and questions were so frequent and so diverse in their method of attack that it would be impossible for me to account for all of them on paper. But in an attempt to reveal to the reader just how they operated, I'll give one example. The backdrop for this particular episode was the exhaustion I'd felt from the continual inner turmoil. This kind of exhaustion would often lead to periods of utter despair where I just wanted to give up and give in. During these times, I would often wish that I could actually die. Yet to die was a fearful prospect because the feeling of uncertainty about my salvation might mean that I could end up in hell. So then I began to wish that I could be an animal instead of a human. I would watch a bird sitting in a tree outside the window and think, boy, if I could just be like him, to just instinctively exist without all these questions and doubts and the fear they create. I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Then just after that came the next brutal twist. Atheists don't see themselves as being any different from animals. The thought leapt up in my mind like an unexpected charge of a lion out of the midst of the tall grass. Does this mean I want to be, or actually already might be, an atheist? The question demanded an immediate answer. No, it can't mean that, I shouted back at it in my head. The possibility sickened me as I pondered how meaningless my life would be if I were to be an atheist. My argument against it continued. If you were a true atheist, you wouldn't be at all troubled by the fact that you were. But then I'd think, maybe atheists really are troubled, but they just hide it. What if the real reason you've been reading all those apologetic books hasn't been so that you could give a reasoned answer for the hope that lies in you, but rather because you really never had any hope to begin with? Then I'd argue back, but I have placed my hope in the Lord, and the scripture states that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Yes, that may be true, but what if this only applies to those who don't doubt or disbelieve? The inner debate wore on. If you truly believed, you wouldn't be freaking out right now. Oh, but I have believed. I really have. My thoughts would shout back. Then I prayed in desperation, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. These horrible strivings within were my desperate effort to find the one perfect reassurance which I thought could dissolve all my fear and uncertainty concerning my eternal standing with God. They were also the pinnacle, the towering terror of all the obsessive themes that my disorder had latched onto. Now obsessing over health concerns seemed like a walk in the park in comparison. Accompanying this nightmare was the old accusation that I had somehow sinned by publicly sharing about my anxiety disorder. I began to entertain the notion that my situation might be the consequence of my unbelief, and that I had sinned by getting up and acting as if I had faith in God, when now it appeared that I might not have any faith at all. What if I was a phony, a fake? I found the notion appalling. Words fall short of my being able to convey just how excruciating the mental pain became from these obsessional themes. Horror gripped me, mind, heart, and soul. When Sunday rolled around, I would sit in the pew feeling like a blight that had no place among the children of God. I felt like a contaminant in their midst. This battle to gain a feeling of certainty about my salvation raged on for quite some time. There were many tangled and twisted turns along the way, but every path led back to one basic fear: eternal separation from God. Every effort or attempt to gain reassurance only led to one more doubt-filled what if. The harder I struggled against those doubts, the greater and more powerful grip they would have on me. How could I ignore these things when to do so might mean the eternal damnation of my soul? How could I find peace when my very own heart condemned me? Later on, my eyes would open up to the realization that God's grace and salvation are not dependent upon the fickleness of my emotional states. Whenever our hearts condemn us, we must remember that God is greater than our hearts, and He knows everything. But first, I needed to be educated about why I had become so stuck in these obsessive cycles. I needed to come to grips with the fact that I had OCD. Well, that describes, the beginning of one of my obsessional periods about my salvation and my relationship with Christ. And the reason that happened was I was already in a state of hyped up anxiety. I had already been having obsessions about health and various other things prior to that happening, and I had been having a lot of panic attacks and other symptoms of anxiety. In retrospect, when I look back on those things, now that my serotonin levels are balanced and I'm not having too much fight or flight emotions in my body and in my mind, I can think about all of those obsessions and think, that was so strange. I feel completely calm and confident about my relationship with Christ now, but I wasn't in a bad flare of my disorder. So the way my mind is reacting to those thoughts is entirely different now. So the next time we talk, I'm going to go back to the fly trap analogy and talk about the fly and what to do when it buzzes in. Anyway, I'll talk to you later, and thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.